Revelation chapter 10. Then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud, with a rainbow over his head, and his face was like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire. All this imagery used to describe this angel or this messenger, it would indicate that this is a allegorical representation of Christ who's coming down now. Verse 2. He had a little scroll open in his hand, and he set his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land, and called out with a loud voice, like a lion roaring. When he called out, the seven thunders sounded. And when the seven thunders had sounded, I was about to write. But I heard a voice from heaven saying, seal up what the seven thunders have said, and do not write it down. And the angel whom I saw standing on sea and land lifted up his right hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and what is in it, the earth and what is in it, and the sea and what is in it, that there should be no more delay, but that in the days of the trumpet call to be sounded by the seventh angel, the mystery of God, as he announced to his servants the prophets, should be fulfilled. Verse 8 is very important. Bracket this into the end of the chapter. Then the voice which I had heard from heaven spoke to me again, saying, go take the scroll, which is open in the hand of the angel who is standing on the sea and on the land. So I went to the angel and told him to give me the little scroll, and he said to me, take it and eat. It will be bitter in your stomach, but sweet as honey in your mouth. So God's message, which is written in the scroll that is being given to John now, is sweet and bitter. So God's message to the churches that John is going to now tell and deliver is also going to be a mixture of sweetness, of good news, but then there's also going to be some sorrow, some bitterness attached to it as well. Verse 10, and I took the little scroll from the hand of the angel, and ate it. It was sweet as honey in my mouth. But when I had eaten it, my stomach was made bitter. And I was told, you must again prophesy about many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. Chapter 11. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff. And I was told, rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and those who worship there. Well, this is very familiar. This should remind you of the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel was given a measuring rod and told to go measure the temple in Jerusalem. And Ezekiel was given a vision of a new temple as well, in a new Jerusalem. That's all in Ezekiel chapter 40, verse 3. Verse 2, but do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample over the holy city for 42 months. Now, this time span of 42 months is very important in two different events. So the siege of Jerusalem, when Rome came and destroyed the city of Jerusalem in AD 70, the siege lasted for 42 months. And also the persecution of Domitian, which happened later in 90 AD, which we believe John is currently undergoing and suffering from and writing about in most of this book, lasted 42 months as well. And so there's a definite similarity between the current persecution, which John is undergoing, and then also the destruction of the holy city of Jerusalem. Now, the vision that John is about to see from chapters 11 through 12, the chronology of the events is not very clear. It definitely points to things that take place in the past. Especially when we get to chapter 12, you'll see that it definitely is pointing to events that took place in the past. And so as here in chapter 11, verse 4 and following, we're going to get descriptions of something that sounds similar to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And so the point I guess I'm trying to make is because chapter 12 clearly deals with events that took place before the persecution of Domitian, the events of chapter 11 can also be talking about events that took place before the persecution of Domitian, namely the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So verse 4, chapter 11, verse 4. Chapter 11, verse 3. And I will grant my 2 witnesses power to prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Verse 4. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands which stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. If anyone would harm them, thus he is doomed to be killed. They have power to, underline, shut the sky, that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have power over the waters to, underline, turn them into blood, and to afflict the earth with, underline, every plague as often as they desire. So these 2 prophets that are being sent to Jerusalem to prophesy for 1,260 days have imagery of Elijah the prophet and Moses, the 2 great prophets of the Old Testament. Also the 2 prophets who appeared next to Christ during his transfiguration on Mount Tabor. So the power to shut the sky, that is exactly what Elijah did during his ministry. Israel, the northern kingdom, they were participating in the worship of Baal, the rain god, the thunder god. And so as punishment, God sent Elijah to shut the sky and bring about a famine in Israel. And then with Moses, the 10 plagues, okay, Moses turned the Nile into blood. And then there's also the phrasing to afflict the earth with every plague, the 10 plagues that Moses brought to Egypt. So there's this Mosaic prophet and another prophet who is like Elijah, preaching in the city of Jerusalem. Verse 7. And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that ascends from the bottomless pit will make war upon them and conquer them and kill them. The beast that ascends from the bottomless pit comes later on in the text. In fact, I could probably just tell you that would be chapter 13, verse 11. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is allegorically called Sodom in Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. All right, so here we get the indication that this is about Jerusalem, because that's where Jesus was crucified. And allegorically, Jerusalem is now the new Sodom. It's now the new Egypt. It has rejected God and is now subject to his punishment. For 3 days and a half, men from the peoples and tribes and tongues and nations gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and make merry and exchange presents, because these 2 prophets had been a torment to those who dwell on the earth. But after the 3.5 days, a breath of life from God entered them, and they stood up on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And in the sight of their foes, they went up to heaven in a cloud. And at that hour, there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to God, to the God of heaven. The second woe has passed. Behold, the third woe is soon to come. So what is John describing here in this vision? Well, it appears we have good reason to think, this is a very rational interpretation, that John is writing about events that took place prior to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now, what particular specific events is all this imagery referring to? We don't know, because unfortunately we don't have a complete omniscient knowledge regarding the past historical events that took place. And so, really, when it comes to reading the book of Revelation, the only, not the only mystery, but one of the biggest hindrances to understanding the meaning of the text can oftentimes be attributed to just a lack of historical knowledge, a lack of events that never got recorded. So, who are these two prophets that preached in Jerusalem prior to its destruction? We don't know. Do these two prophets represent some saints? And all the imagery used surrounding their death and their death and their preaching relate to real historical characters? Absolutely. Most likely that is, if you're understanding this as a reference to events that took place prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, then yeah, this is referring to something that would have taken place then. But alas, our knowledge is incomplete of everything that happened in Jerusalem prior to its destruction. And so, thus, our ability to understand the symbolism of the book of Revelation is also incomplete. All right, moving on to chapter 11, verse 15. Then the seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever." And the 24 elders who sit on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshipped God, saying, "We give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, who are and who were, that you have taken your great power and begun to reign. The nations raged, but your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged, for rewarding your servants, the prophets and saints, and those who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying the destroyers of the earth." All right, so mark a dash here. This is another example of a bad chapter division. If chapter 12 began here, then things would start to make sense in the text and the way that it flows with the regular chapter divisions. All right, so just make a note, this is another bad chapter division. Really, chapter 12 should begin here, and you'll see why in a moment. Then, so chapter 11, verse 19. Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. And there were flashes of lightning, loud noises, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. Chapter 12, verse 1. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. So obviously we just transitioned from John has seen the Ark of the Covenant to now seeing the new Ark. Remember, the Ark is it's typology for the Blessed Mother. Right? The Ark contains and bears the Word of God, the Ten Commandments, the manna, the bread of life, right, is kept within the Ark of the Covenant. And then Mary, who's the new Ark, contains the Word of God, right, the Word made flesh, who gives himself as the bread of life in the sacrament of the Eucharist. And so this transition from the old Ark to the new Ark is intentional in the vision that John sees. And that's why I was saying chapter 12 is a bad division. You wouldn't want to break up that two imagery. It's all part of one image, one vision going together. And we also, in chapter 12, as I mentioned previously, we're going to get references to events that definitely took place in the past prior to John's persecution. So chapter 12, verse 2. She was with child, and she cried out in her pangs of birth in anguish for delivery. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems upon his heads. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, that he might devour her child when she brought it forth. She brought forth a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. Rejoice then, O heaven, and you that dwell therein. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had borne the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river which the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, and on those who keep the commandments of God and bear testimony to Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. Chapter 13. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems upon its horns, and a blasphemous name was upon its head. This is the 4th beast from the book of Daniel, chapter 7. So this is Rome emerging from the sea, and Rome is going to be possessed by this dragon. Okay, and so what John is alerting to us is that the persecution of the Romans wasn't just merely political, it wasn't just merely human, it was demonically driven. Verse 2, And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth followed the beast with wonder. So this mortal wound that was healed from the beast. Couple different ways of understanding this. It could be that when Nero died, it appeared that the demonic persecution of the church had come to an end with the death of Nero. And now with the rise of Domitian as emperor, and he launches his own persecution against the church 20 years later, it appears that, well, the demonic influence behind these Caesars hasn't died. It hasn't gone away. It's now returned with a vengeance. So that's one interpretation, that Nero appeared to be dead, but now Domitian has arisen as this new Nero. Another possibility is that this is some event that took place in the life of one of the Caesars that we don't know about. Maybe Domitian almost died in his youth, and then he recovered, though, from some mortal wound. That could also be what this imagery is referring to. All right, so the important point is to remember that this imagery is grounded in historical events, and that there's several different possible explanations for the different imagery. So you never want to get tied down to one definitive interpretation of Revelation that is the end all be all. Because if you do that, well, then you're probably definitely going to be wrong, because no one else has nailed down the imagery with 100% degrees of certitude ever. All right, so chapter 13, verse 4. Men worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? And who can fight against it?" All right, there is a cult to the Caesars. There's a cult to the Roman Empire. And behind every pagan cult is a demonic personality, right? So people who worship the Caesars, who worship Domitian as a god, were in fact worshiping Satan, who probably was possessing Domitian. I can't remember about Domitian, but I know exorcists have told me that Nero definitely is very, very much so tied up with demonic influences. So, but that's another topic for another class. All right, verse 5. And the beast was given a mouth, uttering haughty and blasphemous words. All right, this should start to remind you again of Daniel chapter 7. And the blasphemous words that are being uttered are what is true blasphemy. It's claiming equality with God. So this beast is making itself God. The emperor, the Caesar, is making himself God, and he's imposing his worship, the worship of himself, throughout the empire. We know that's exactly what Domitian was doing in his persecution of the Christians. And it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. That's the length of the persecution of Domitian. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints. That line is taken directly from Daniel chapter 7, verse 21. And to conquer them. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and tongue and nation. And all who dwell on earth will worship it. They'll worship Caesar. Everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. All right, whenever an author writes, if anyone has an ear, let him hear, that means that there is an immediate need for the audience to listen. And John is writing this book, remember, as a letter to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. So he's telling his audience, listen up. This is what is immediately relevant to you. He's had the visions of, the destruction of Jerusalem. He talked about, the virgin giving birth to the child and the virgin escaping from the dragon, okay, like the allegory of Mary going to Egypt. But now when John writes about this beast coming from the sea, right, which is the image of Daniel chapter 7, this final empire, before the stone that was cut from, that is not cut by human hands, comes and displaces the empires of the world. This is the final battle to take place. And he's letting his audience know, pay attention, this is what is relevant for you. Verse 10, if anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone slays with the sword must he be slain. This is taken from the book of the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 15, verse 2. And Jeremiah prophesied about the Babylonian captivity. So now in the book of Revelation, Rome has taken on the new imagery, the new title of Babylon as its code name. And in fact, in the epistles of St. Peter, Peter writes to his audience talking about how he's writing from Babylon. So we know the early church used Babylon as this code for the city of Rome. And we'll get references later in the book of Revelation to the city of Babylon. And keeping in mind this verse, okay, will help us understand, what is the author talking about when he's talking about, Babylon? He's talking about Rome. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. Verse 11, then I saw another beast who rose out of the land. All right, remember, anytime you get earth, you just make a note to or always get in the habit of remembering that, this could also be just read the land. So what is the land? Well, the land is where John is, right? It's the Middle East. It's Asia Minor, or it's in Israel. So this beast rises out of the local land. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. So who's this beast referring to? One likely interpretation that works is that this beast from the earth are the pagan authorities in Asia Minor who work with the Roman Empire in order to impose Domitian's will. All right, so the local authorities who are now in cahoots with the Roman Empire is this new beast. Verse 12, it exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. So remember, one of the themes that John keeps bringing up is that idolatry, Caesar worship, is the issue. All right, this beast from the sea is people are being forced to worship it, and by worshiping it, they're worshiping the dragon Satan. And now this beast of the land, the local beast, is helping enforce the worship of the beast from the sea, helping to enforce the worship of Rome. Verse 13, it works great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of men, and by the signs which it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast. It deceives those who dwell on land, bidding them make an image for the beast, which was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast should even speak, and to cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or on the forehead. So to be marked on the right hand or the forehead. This imagery first comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 8, where Moses told the people to have the law of Moses, all right, on the frontlets of their heads, okay, to keep the law of God always in their mind, and to keep it on their hands, that also in their actions, they act out the law of God. And now the imagery is being reversed, where the beast is enforcing everyone to have its mark on their hand and on their law. So the beast is imposing Roman law, the law of Rome, the law of Caesar worship on everyone's minds and on everyone's hands, okay? It wants them to occupy their foremost thoughts, and it wants to see them putting it into action. So that no one can buy or sell, verse 17, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is the name of the beast or the number of its name. So the marketplace in the ancient world was in the town square. It was the public forum, right, where everyone would go in public. You did not drive out of the town to then get into Walmart, all right, to just kind of go out of the place. So if you want to buy and sell, you have to enter the marketplace. You have to be in the public square, the center of the city. And so you cannot go about in public, so this is saying, unless you have the mark of the beast. All right, you cannot go out in public unless you partake in the Caesar worship. verse 18, this calls for wisdom. Let him who has understanding reckon the number of the beast. So it calls for wisdom. Let him who has understanding, let him reckon. Who is it that has wisdom, who has understanding? That would be King Solomon, David's son. All right, he was given great wisdom, and he was given understanding and reckoning. So the imagery is already starting to recall to the mind of the audience who knows the Old Testament. Okay, this is pointing towards Solomon, the wise king. And then that imagery is confirmed in a second. The number of the beast, for it is a human number. Its number is 666. Now the imagery of Solomon comes full circle. So if you remember from Solomon's downfall, Solomon, everyone remembers that he had many wives, and that because of his pagan wives and concubines, they turned his heart away from God, and he would offer incense to their gods, and he built altars to their gods as well. But if you remember, prior to Solomon taking many wives, Solomon also multiplied his horses, and he also multiplied his gold. Two other things that were forbidden for the king of Israel to do according to the law found in Deuteronomy chapter 17. And so when Solomon multiplied his gold, he had 666, or maybe it was like 666,000 talents of gold. It was that exact number range. I don't remember the exact number of zeros after which the 666 part comes. But so the number 666, its prior appearance in the Bible refers to the beginning of Solomon's downfall. And when the end of Solomon's downfall had to do with the worshiping of pagan gods in Israel. Now, think for a second of Solomon. By the way, this is all in 1 Kings chapter 10. This is where you get the downfall of Solomon and what he does. So in 1 Kings chapter 10, Solomon, in order to please his wives, is building temples to their pagan gods. And Solomon, in order to please his wives, is offering incense to these pagan gods. Now, what would you be expected to do if you were part of the aristocracy living in Jerusalem with Solomon the king performing these actions? Socially, to stay in the king's good favor, you would also go along with this polytheism, okay, and also worship alongside Solomon. All right, so you keep the king happy because the king is trying to keep his wives happy. You don't want to make the king's wives unhappy, right? It might spell your own political downfall. And so, in the reign of Solomon, there's some parallel to what the Caesars of Rome are doing. The Caesars of Rome are enforcing state paganism. And in a way, Solomon was definitely enforcing a social state paganism where, there was a social expectation to go along with what the king was doing. We don't have any records that Solomon actually enforced the worship of his pagan gods, but it's possible that he could have done that, in his downfall. But at the very least, socially, there would have been social pressure that you can only imagine for people to go along and worship the pagan idols that Solomon had put up to keep the king happy. All right, so the number 666, it recalls Solomon. What else does it recall? Because this is, one of the big numbers that people like to, play with and get spooky and weird about. So first off, just remember 6 is not an evil number. Creation was made in 6 days, and God declared creation was very good. In fact, some of the church fathers even said 6 is the number of Jesus Christ. Without really getting into that, just realize that 6 does not mean imperfection, all right, which is a common way of interpreting 6. Some people think that 7 is the number of perfection, and 6 is one less than 7. So then 6 is imperfection and it's evil. There's no biblical basis for that numerology. 1, we know 7 isn't the number of perfection. 3 is. 7 is the number of covenant. 7 is the number of covenant. It's also the number of the Gentiles. 6, one less than 7. What does that number mean? Well, creation. Is creation evil? No, we're not Gnostics, all right? Creation is very good. So what is 666, all right, in the beast of the devil? It could be the, 666, the perfection of creation or the perfection of created wealth. In Aramaic, their numbers are not separate from their letters. Okay, their numbers are not separate from their letters. We already talked about this a little bit in Matthew's gospel when we talked about 14 and David, how if you were to make a math equation that would equal out 14, it would also be writing out the name of David. And so 14 is the number of David. And in Matthew's gospel, that's why Matthew talks about 14 generations, between all the different landmarks, Babylonian captivity to Jesus, and 14 between, I think it was David and the Babylonian captivity. I can't remember. You can go back and reference Matthew chapter 1. So 666. What does 666 look like written out in Aramaic? Well, when it's written out, it's code for Nero. It is the code name for Nero. And in the Google Classroom, I'll post an image so you can see how all the numbers and the letters relate to each other. So there's like 1,000 ways to interpret this that people have probably come up with over the years. However, one that's very sensible given the context of the text and grounded in historical research is that the 666 refers to Caesar Nero. And again, just reference the picture in the classroom for further reference. All right, and we will conclude here for today.